Okay, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, Israel time, early morning at the in the West Coast and in between on the East Coast. You know, the world is confronting what seems to be a major crisis. Over 100,000 Russian troops surrounding Ukraine from three corners, north, south, and east. And there is a fear of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Russia also raised all kinds of demands, which at least thus far doesn't seem that the United States and NATO accept them. And actually many American observers, as well as President Biden himself, stated that this crisis is the most dangerous crisis, at the very least since the end of the Cold War, and maybe from the point of view of European security, since World War II. However, crisis always gives some opportunities, and the opportunities for us is to host three leading international relations scholars from the United States who are worldwide well-known, published a lot, and are experts on American foreign policy and Russian foreign policy and global affairs more generally. And they are Professor Bill Wohlforth from Dartmouth College, Professor James Goldgeier from American University, and Professor Charles Kupchan from Georgetown University. In a few minutes, I will introduce them in greater length. But before that, I wanted to suggest a couple of background points briefly before we turn to our esteemed guests. And then again, I will introduce them in greater length. So I will share with you a PowerPoint that highlights some of the points in this crisis. A minute. רקפת? אני חושב שאת צריכה, איך זה? Okay, so one of the key concepts involved in this crisis is the concept of sphere of influence. And that seems to be the key Russian demand, that basically the objective of Putin is to restore the Cold War. For that matter, the demands include the expectation or the commitment of NATO and the United States that the eastward expansion of NATO will end, that Ukraine specifically will not join NATO, and actually there will also be drawdown of NATO troops and material in Eastern Europe much more broadly than Ukraine. All those Eastern European states will join NATO since the end of the Cold War. Okay, what are the potential motivations of Putin for this idea of this demand for reestablishment of a sphere of influence, notably in Ukraine? So we have a number of competing motivation here, motives here. Obviously, the most salient, kind of the realist, the material, establishing a security zone near the border, avoiding deployment of adversaries' military, and basically kind of a geostrategic element of reducing security threat to the national security of Russia. But there is also the status element, that Russia is a great power, so it should benefit from the great power privilege of having a sphere of influence, of having a sphere of influence, like the United States with the Monroe Doctrine, and maybe China in East Asia potentially in the future. And that is different from the idea of sovereign equality, that all the states, all the members of the UN have a kind of share equality in their sovereignty. And the Putin's claim is no, great powers have special privileges. There is also the nationalist element, specifically in Eastern Ukraine with the Russian-speaking ethnic Russian minority, but it goes much beyond that. The Putin claim is there is no Ukrainian nation. All of them are Russians, and also the territory there used to belong to Russia in a supposedly golden age. So basically it should be under Russian control, directly or indirectly through a sphere of influence. Others argue it's all domestic politics. Putin basically would like to divert attention from domestic economic problems inside Russia, so rallying around the flag, that's the idea. There is finally also the ideological element, and that is the idea or the fear of Putin of color revolutions, namely that the neighborhood will go through democratization, and then the Russian public itself will get the appetite to become democratic, and that's obviously a threat for the Putin's regime, and that's really his key concern. Finally, we have the the underlying that's supposedly the Russian advantage here. Much greater proximity to Russia, Ukraine, and all Eastern Europe than the United States. So supposedly Russian interest is much greater. And Russia also feels threatened, supposedly, because of NATO eastward expansion since the late 1990s. And in the balance of power, the global balance of power, supposedly there has been in recent years a gradual shift from unipolarity, from the American dominance to multipolarity, and that is leading to great power competition. Most notably, it's the rise of China, both economically and militarily. Russia, not so much economically, but militarily, and also its other material card is the energy dependence of Europe and Russia. When you have in the system rising powers, they might become revisionists. They are rising demands for major change in the system and in the distribution of rewards. Whereas for the United States, supposedly the image there is a declining willingness for global leadership, especially military engagement, definitely in the Middle East, after Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw the messy withdrawal from Afghanistan, but partly also in Europe, at least partly because of the rise of China and the focus on East Asia. So finally, Putin's fundamental objective is to change the post-Cold War international order and to go back, rather than to the liberal order that Americans and Europeans expected, back to the Cold War type of order, great power, sphere of influence, at the expense of small states, freedom of choice, and even territorial integrity, like the annexation of Crimea by Russia almost 8 years ago. Okay, now let's move to our panelists, and let's start with Professor, and after the presentation, their presentation will open the floor to questions and comments by the audience. And the first speaker will be Professor Bill Wohlforth. Bill is the Daniel Webster Professor at Dartmouth College, where he teaches in the Department of Government. His research concerns international security, international relations theory, and US and Russia's foreign policy. From 2017 to 2020, he served as the research director of the International Trends Lab at Mijimo University in Moscow. It's the University of the Foreign Office there, or something like that. Okay, Bill, the floor is yours.
Benny, thank you so much. It's so nice to see you and to hear your voice again. I really, really miss you. And I see some colleagues on the call whom I know and respect. And in respect to your assembled brilliance, I will try to keep my comments very short. I am astonished having So I have four very quick points to make about this crisis, coming from my perspective that Benny described. International relations scholar who's on and off been studying Moscow foreign policy and Moscow's perceptions of international relations since the 1980s. The first point is that Russia has always been dissatisfied with the European security order, and Russia has never, ever reconciled to a Ukraine embedded in the Western security structure. This has been true of all Russian governments, Yeltsin, Medvedev, Putin, and most Russian elites. When Russia has cooperated with the West and cooperated with Ukraine, that cooperation has been meant to realize those objectives. That is to say, to prevent those undesired outcomes of a European security structure that excludes Russia and that includes Ukraine. So you can point to a history of cooperation, but that history of cooperation never implied reconciling itself to the post-Cold War security order or to Ukraine's incorporation in a non-Russian or anti-Russian security structure in Europe. The second point is that measures short of war have failed to achieve Russia's objectives. Economic pressure, cyber operations, covert operations, manipulation, active measures, attempts to influence domestic policy, and of course, diplomacy with Kiev and with West have failed to deliver what Russia wants. Indeed, in detailed statements, lengthy speeches, articles, interviews, Russian leaders have made it perfectly clear that over the course of 2021, they think that that Ukraine is being used as an instrument against Russia by the United States, and that if they cannot compel a policy reversal, they will seek military solutions. Lengthy articles, lengthy speeches laying this out. Not only has Ukraine continued to be used as an instrument against Russia, but in fact, its westward trajectory is not only not reversing, but accelerating. Zelensky, who came into power as a person standing for negotiation with Russia, has, again, the Russian view, taken a hard line and sought to reduce what levers of influence Moscow still had in Ukraine, and has, of course, enhanced cooperation with the West. In some sense, inviting NATO into Ukraine, even if Ukraine is not invited into NATO. This turnabout essentially dashed any hopes that Russia had of achieving a desirable political settlement and removed a diplomatic path for Russia to get out from under the Western sanctions. And frankly, if you read these speeches, and here's where kind of the nationalism stuff, in my view, comes in. If you read these speeches, there's a kind of disdain, contempt for the Ukrainian leadership. There's numerous statements that the Russian authorities see no further point to negotiating with Zelensky, viewing his administration as a puppet of the United States. And so they've instead decided to negotiate with the puppet master, Washington. So that's the second view. Measure short that Russia is now seeking to realize its long-standing objective, which again sounds aggressive, but to their ears is defensive. It seeks to prevent bad outcomes, namely to prevent a security architecture in Europe that totally excludes Russia, and to prevent Ukraine's incorporation into that security architecture. So these defensive objectives, in their view, it's now seeking to realize by exploiting its decisive local military superiority over Ukraine. Over the course of 2021 and up to the very day, to this minute that we're sitting here speaking, Russia has assembled a force posture around Ukraine that gives it a large range of military choices. Which choices it will take are left uncertain. So it's telegraphing a punch, but it's not telling you where that punch is going to land. As the alarm in Ukraine and in the West over this deployment has risen, Russia has issued demands for written, ironclad, legal, formal agreements to halt NATO expansion forever, to roll back defense cooperation with non-NATO members, and to return NATO force deployments to their pre-1997 state. Now, these demands have been made publicly in the form of draft treaties, not a usual approach to diplomacy to publish your approach this way. So noting the obvious fact that nobody knows Putin's risk acceptance, we do not know his precise calculus, this is obvious. We analysts, everybody, are debating kind of how to interpret the observable evidence that we do have. Lacking an inner ear inside the Kremlin that we can listen to Putin's conversations, we look at observable evidence. There's two pieces of observable evidence. There's a military deployment that I just spoke of, and there's the diplomacy, the talk, the speeches, the writings, the explanations, the draft treaties. And so there's a debate. The debate fundamentally hinges upon, is a diplomatic solution possible and what would it look like? And that brings me to my fourth point, which is now here I'm moving from, I think, a statement of fairly well-established realities to an opinion or an assessment or an analysis, which is, I believe that a war-avoiding diplomatic settlement is unlikely in this case. At root of this are two problems well identified in international relations theory, problems which have interestingly come out forcefully, repeatedly, and insistently in Russian communications. The first problem is the commitment problem. Who is going to ensure that anybody who signs an agreement keeps to that agreement? Moscow does not trust Kiev to implement any solution regarding the Ukraine situation. In its view, Ukrainian leaders reneged on Minsk I, Minsk II, and they see no reason why the current regime to abide by any Minsk III. Putin in particular, meanwhile, has repeatedly and insistently stated that he doesn't trust the West to abide by agreements because he cites a litany of such agreements that the West has reneged upon as soon as it finds these agreements inconvenient to itself. And so we have a commitment problem. In addition, we have another well-identified problem in international relations theories discussed by scholars Jeffrey Blaney, Robert Gilpin, Robert Jervis, Jim Fearon, namely uncertainty. Each side has a different estimate of the costs and benefits of the use of force. What can solve both of these problems, namely the commitment problem and the problem of uncertainty, is war, possibly. In other words, war could conceivably, if it results in either the physical control over Ukraine or a compliant regime in Kiev, would solve the commitment problem for Russia. And of course, Russia would prove who's right about the distribution of power. So that's what brings us to this current moment. A clash of interests and problem of credible commitments of how to commit to any deal that we make, and disagreements over bargaining power. So that's what we're debating here today. Let me just conclude by noting under this fourth point of the unlikelihood, in my view, of a diplomatic settlement, why many analysts think this way. Or to put it more accurately, why is it that I, sitting before you, have been persuaded by the large and growing coterie of very careful analysts who think that a diplomatic settlement is unlikely. So a couple really quick points, and then I'll conclude as to why I think this is unlikely. Russia, I think, is strongly convinced that it possesses decisive and comprehensive local military superiority. Therefore, it does not regard the Ukrainian military as a significant obstacle to pretty much any military operation they wish. In addition, Russia's experience of the use of force is the exact opposite in recent years of the American experience. The Russian experience largely is, it works. It worked in Chechnya, it worked in Georgia, it worked in Syria, it worked in Crimea. No forever wars for Russia. Rather, decisive uses of force that have been low cost to Russia and, in their view, delivered big benefits. So they're coming at this crisis from the opposite perspective of their American interlocutors, weary after 20 years of fighting inconclusive wars that don't deliver results. Russia, in addition, might believe, and this is the most controversial point or the hardest point for people who read the Western media to understand. I'm not sure that I believe this, but I'm telling you what I think many Russians might believe, namely that Ukrainians' true preferences, at least the preferences of many millions of Ukrainian citizens, are not reflected very well in public opinion polling. I think many Russians think that deep inside, many Ukrainians hold the belief that they might be actually better off under a government that was more favoring towards Russia. And that therefore, if a decisive moment you think would actually either step aside and allow things to develop or actively collaborate. And so they think, therefore, that Ukraine is more subvertible than most people in the West, and certainly almost anybody you talk to in Ukraine these days would say. Russians tend to view the Ukrainian elite as a manipulable oligarchy that they can control, that is open to such control. This runs deep in Putin's writings, for example. And so therefore, bottom line is they might well think that a successful regime change operation, and a regime change at the end of the day is the chief solution to their problems with Ukraine, is actually doable. Finally, let me just note that with over $500 billion in reserves, a cowed domestic opposition, a protective partner in Beijing, and a US that has already explicitly announced that China is its main rival, where it wants to devote most of its resources, and therefore has scant interest in a new Cold War with Russia, Moscow, and also, by the way, in view of significant differences in Europe over how strong the sanctions they would support in response to a Russian invasion. For all these reasons, Moscow might well think that it could weather whatever sanctions regime come into force after a Russian use of force. Much of this, of course, would hinge on whether Russia's potential bet on a successful regime change operation is whether that turns out. All of that would determine the nature of the costs Russia would impose. So that's essentially a quick take on this crisis that's pessimistic. There's obviously another view, and that view is that this is more of a bluff, that Putin would be able to settle for long talks with Lavrov and Wendy Sherman about kind of like, INF things. And I think that any sort of outcome of that nature, a long series of more or less inconclusive talks, would be viewed as a dramatic step down or backing down by Putin, which to me seems very, very unlikely. Okay, so with that, I will conclude. I look forward to what my colleagues have to say and what the comment and question and answer session brings.
Thank you very much, Bill, for your extremely useful comments. The next speaker will be Professor Charlie Kupchan. Charlie is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served on the National Security Council under President Clinton and Obama. And his most recent book, among quite a few books, is Isolationism, a History, which came out, I think, by Oxford University, right, at last year or almost 2020. Charlie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Benny. Nice to see good friends in both sides of, I guess, here and elsewhere. I'm going to be very brief and pick up on a number of points that Bill made. One sec. First, I view the sources of this conflict in a way that's quite similar to Bill. It is, in my mind, the culmination of 2 decades plus of the continuing enlargement of NATO. The Russians made clear way back in the Yeltsin era that they were uncomfortable with the expansion of NATO as the core of building a post-Cold War order. And I think what we're seeing here is they've been basically saying enough, stop. And I actually don't have any profound discomfort with the Russian position, in the sense that I think Putin is a troublemaker. He's coercive, he's aggressive, he's oppressive. Most of what he does is in my mind, unjustifiable. On this particular point, Russian discomfort with the potential membership of Ukraine in NATO, I get it. Great powers don't like it when other great powers show up on their doorsteps. The United States spent the 19th century pushing Britain, France, Spain, Russia out of the Western Hemisphere. When the Soviets put missiles in Cuba in 1962, we almost triggered World War III. So what Putin is doing vis-a-vis objecting to NATO membership is what I think 99% of leaders around the world would do. And we shouldn't be surprised. And you know, when I hear American decision makers say NATO is a defensive alliance, if Russia's uncomfortable with it, it's their problem, because we all know that NATO means no harm. I think I understand where they're coming from. It's based in what does this look like from Moscow? And as a consequence, it seems to me that, you know, we are in a crisis that is to some extent understandable and to be expected. And I think it's come to a head on Ukraine, partly for geopolitical reasons, a long border, land and sea border with Russia, and for mystical, socio-cultural reasons, language ties, the roots of Russia in Kievan Rus, religious ties. I'd be interested to hear what Bill has to say about this, but I think one of the biggest setbacks for Russia over the last few years was the separation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Russian Orthodox Church. This really stuck in the craw of Putin and other Russian elites. So that's my view of what's going on here. Second observation. There is a kind of cruel irony to the situation that we find ourselves in that NATO membership for Ukraine is not under discussion. It's not foreseen. The United States and its allies understand that Ukraine and its membership in NATO understandably makes Russia uncomfortable, and that's precisely why the US has limited its armaments of Ukraine, has moved slowly. Why is it that Biden has said, we're not going to send combat troops to Ukraine? We're not going to go to war with Russia. In some ways, this is an indication of an understanding of the Russian position. And in that respect, I throw out as a question, given that in principle, NATO wants to stand by its open door policy, but in reality, Ukrainian membership is not envisaged anytime soon. Can't we find some kind of diplomatic language that everybody can live with? Can't we find something short of a legal guarantee that allows NATO to stand by its open door policy, but at the same time acknowledges that Ukraine is not now or anytime soon on the path to NATO membership? Now, I don't know the answer to that question. I hope that behind closed doors and in these messages that the Russians and the US and NATO are passing back and forth, they're looking for that language. Because if we end up in Ukraine in a full-scale Russian invasion and occupation of the country for something that is unlikely to happen, it would be a huge pity, a huge setback. Third observation, I think Biden, with the caveat that I don't know what's being said about NATO enlargement behind closed doors, I think they basically have it right, which is to engage in dogged diplomacy, keep the channels of communication open. Almost every day over the last few weeks, there's been some kind of US, Russia, NATO, Russia, US, NATO, US, EU, EU, Russia, Normandy format, Ukraine, Russia, you name it. There's an enormous flurry of diplomacy, and that's as it should be, because that is the way out of this crisis. And I think generally the sticks that the US and its allies are putting forward are the right ones. Very serious, far-reaching economic sanctions, the reinforcement of NATO's eastern frontier. And in preparation for such measures, homework focused on getting gas to Europe, because this to me is in some ways the weakest link. A Europe that relies upon Russian imports of oil and gas for a substantial part of its energy needs. The prospect of Putin either reducing the flow of gas or turning it off entirely. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Putin has 600 billion in reserves. He's got a close relationship with China. He's less vulnerable today than he was in 2014. And he sees the other side as weak. I think part of the reason that he chose to move now is the high price of gas. We're in the middle of winter. Merkel is gone. Biden is facing the lowest approval ratings of his presidency. Germany has said, no, you can't overfly our country to get weapons to Ukraine. So there are cracks there. I think some of those cracks would go away if we see tanks rolling down the streets of Kiev. But my sense is that Putin said, this is a good time for me to push back and to push back hard. My final observation, I'm somewhat more optimistic than Bill that we can avoid a conflict. And I say that in part because it's hard for me to envisage the feasible military objectives. And let me just kind of dig down into that point. It would be easy for Russia to grab Donbass, to take a chunk of eastern Ukraine, to join Donbass to Crimea. They could do that, I don't know, in a few days. But it doesn't achieve the strategic objective of keeping Ukraine or bringing Ukraine back into the fold and keeping the West out. In fact, it would do the opposite. It would alienate most of Ukraine and create a rump Ukraine that would run as fast as it can towards NATO and Europe. So that means that what he's got to do, if he wants to keep Ukraine in the fold, is invade and occupy the country. Does he really have the stomach for that? I see Putin as a troublemaker, but most of the risks that he has run over the last few years are low cost. Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, Donbass, Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, Libya. Invading and occupying Ukraine, dealing with a country in which he has made Ukrainians anti-Russian, I have a hard time believing that he's going to do that. And he would face punishing sanctions. We don't know exactly which ones, but I can be pretty confident that they would be far-reaching. So given what I think would be a demanding military occupation and an insurgency, that runs for years, I'm guessing that Putin wouldn't mind finding some kind of resolution. And I see sort of two places to focus. One is on finding some language on NATO enlargement that everybody can live with. And two, and this I guess is sort of a Hail Mary, getting Ukraine to step up, either on the Minsk process or on some other outreach to Russia that helps break this logjam. I don't think that's likely because Ukrainian politics has become so pro-Europe and pro-NATO. But, you know, Zelensky is a little bit like like Trump, a little bit like Boris Johnson. You never know what you're going to get with him. That's partly why he was elected. He's an iconoclast. Not inconceivable to me that he could run some play that ends up opening some diplomatic doors. Over to you, Benny.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Last but not least is my old friend from graduate school, Professor Jim Goldgeier. But just for the audience, the Minsk process is kind of the European effort after the and that's an alternative route to the American-Russian negotiation. Professor, let me introduce now Professor James Goldgeier. He's now a visiting scholar at Stanford University, Center for International Security and Cooperation, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a professor of international relations at the School of International Service at American University, where he served as the dean from 2011 to 2017. And Jim, if I may add, published a lot on Russian foreign policy and in American Russian relations and international relation theory in general. Jim, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Benny. It's great to be with everyone. Great to hear from Bill and Charlie. I wanted to cover some of the same background that Bill did, but from a slightly different angle with respect to sort of thinking about how we got here in the 90s. You know, there's been a lot of talk about whether the West promised the Russians that NATO would never enlarge. For me, that debate is so frustrating. First of all, I don't think it's resolvable, but I also think it's a total distraction from really understanding what the key things that were said in the early 90s between the United States and Russia, the West and Russia, and even going back to the end of the Soviet period, because there were assurances given, but the assurance that was given was this, that as the Soviet Union and then Russia retreated from Europe, the United States and its allies would not seek to undermine Russian security. And from the West's perspective, the West did things to demonstrate that they were living up to those assurances. The United States withdrew significant numbers of troops from Europe. The United States pursued arms control agreements with the Russians. The United States withdrew nuclear weapons from Europe. And with respect to NATO, since the United States and its allies, as Charlie was saying, or Bill, I forget which one, sees NATO as a defensive alliance, they didn't view the enlargement of NATO as going back on that assurance regarding the undermining of Russian security. The West pursued the NATO-Russia Founding Act at the same time that it was announcing its enlargement to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, this idea that there would be a new relationship between NATO and Russia, in which there were assurances there also given that given of the time, there wasn't going to be any need for any kind of permanent infrastructure in those new member states with deployment of troops. And that's why we've seen rotational deployments and not the establishment of permanent infrastructure. So from the West standpoint, they look at what happened and see assurances about not undermining Russian security. They feel like they delivered on that. But of course, from the Russian standpoint, they're looking at NATO enlarging and thinking, you said you wouldn't undermine our security, and here you're moving this Cold War alliance closer to our borders. So of course, from the Russian perspective, it looks like a betrayal. I think it's worth mentioning this 2008 Bucharest Declaration, which was one of the worst decisions that could have been made. It certainly was the worst decision that could have been made at the time. So in 2008, NATO had a summit. It had gone through 2 rounds of enlargement. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came in 99. 2004, you had 7 more countries coming in, including the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Bill Burns, who served as ambassador in Moscow in 2007, 2008, argues in his memoir that the Russians did accommodate themselves to that enlargement, could have accommodated themselves to that enlargement, and the real mistake. And as he was warning, if you look at his cables that he's published on his book website, Cables Home, saying that, Ukraine, Georgian membership is a total red line across the political spectrum in Russia, warning his superiors back home that they should not pursue a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. This is sort of a formal process that NATO has, that NATO developed after the first round, the 99 round, to put countries on a more formal track on enlargement. The Bush administration in 2008 wanted to put Ukraine and Georgia on this membership action plan path. Burns was warning them not to do so. Administration still forged ahead, but the French and Germans were opposed. So there was no NATO consensus on that membership action plan. But then in the worst of all worlds, they came up with a NATO. So no concrete path, no timetable, but just a flat out statement that they will become members of NATO. So, and the problem with that is that reflects, that's a NATO consensus document. That's the agreement, that's the language they've all agreed on. So in every NATO document since 2008, every NATO statement, every meeting of a NATO Secretary General with the Ukrainian leader, every time the subject comes up, they have to go back to that consensus language. So, in my view, it's the gift that keeps on giving for Putin because, he can use it front and center as a grievance, even though, as Charlie has said, it doesn't mean anything in practice because Ukraine is not coming into the alliance. The demands put out there by the Russians in mid-December, I think, reflect all the pent-up grievances that they've had, that Putin has, about the way in which the United States was able to dictate the terms of the post-Cold War international order, really sort of saying, this whole thing was a terrible mistake. You screwed us over, and we need you to go back to where you were in 1997. Now, given that I think he knew that he wouldn't get the response to those particular demands, a legal guarantee about no NATO enlargement to Ukraine or this sort of, moving back to positions of 1997 before enlargement took place. Why put those out there? Put them out there because knowing they'd be rejected, it'd give you a pretext to go in, maybe. Put them out there as maximalist demands, hoping you can get, something lesser, maybe. Could be a combination of the two. This idea of a legal guarantee, I find incredibly strange. And especially, what does it mean? And especially for Putin, he's been in office since New Year's Eve, 1999. He has seen presidents walk away from agreements that predecessors have signed. George W. Bush walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Donald Trump, walked away from a number of agreements that Barack Obama had signed. For a guy who thinks he's going to be in power till 2036, why should he think that anything that Joe Biden signs would be, would stick past this presidency? There are things that he can get, and this is put out there. The U.S. has put out that if he wants to have a conversation to try to reduce tensions, to enhance security for all parties, arms control negotiations, agreements on the size and scale of military exercises, agreements on deployments of forces, Putin can get all of those things. And so if that's what he wants, he can get that. One of the big challenges is there isn't going to be some kind of new security architecture in Europe. You can get these agreements, you could get these arms control agreements and these other kinds of agreements. But in terms of an institutional structure, I don't see a different structure emerging. NATO's not going away, and most of Europe is within NATO. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe includes everybody, and this was something the Russians sought very much in the 1990s, and a role for OSCE. But given the role of the OSCE in election monitoring and human rights monitoring, it's it fell out of favor in the Putin years, and remains an incredibly weak institution. I think that it is worth noting that, Russia basically has a sphere of influence. This idea that they need a sphere of influence. As Charlie pointed out, Ukraine's not coming into NATO or the EU. Either is Georgia. Belarus is within the sphere. Russia really controls the situation to a great extent, and isn't going to have more countries joining NATO. NATO enlargement is basically over. And if it weren't for Putin's actions, the aggression, we wouldn't have a Ukraine that was interested in joining NATO. And prior to the invasion of 2014, Ukrainians weren't interested in joining NATO. And prior to the invasion of Ukraine in losing any kind of unifying thread, the Russians have created the unifying theme for NATO, and it's Putin who's keeping an alliance together that otherwise would have greatly lost any sense of purpose. I think I would echo Charlie on how well the Biden has done. There are a lot of moving parts here. I think they put the costs out there, as Bill was saying, may not be enough given the resources that Putin's possesses, but at least, the costs have been put out there for him to know. They've done an excellent job keeping NATO together. They've done it, and despite the fact that they have done an excellent job with their, nothing about Europe without Europe and nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, they have pursued this U.S.-Russia dialogue, which is really what the Russians want the most. In an ideal world for the Russians, they would sit down with the United States and determine everything about European security. And they can't get that, but they can get this U.S.-Russia dialogue, and they are getting that. And it's something that that is very meaningful to them, given their goal of appearing as an equal to the United States. Just close on this question of whether we're going to see further military activity from the Russians in Ukraine. I up until very recently, I was where Bill was in being very pessimistic and was hard for me to see how the Russians were going to take an off-ramp without doing something militarily in Ukraine. I don't think there's going to be a full-scale invasion. I think it's just too costly. I think part of the challenge for us is that, at least for me, like when I look at it from my vantage point, and I see the huge costs of what military activity would mean, and then I look at what the benefits would accrue for Putin, it's just so hard for me to see why he would do it. But his view is very different than my view. His lens is very different than my lens. And I think it really depends on what he ultimately wants. If he wants a conversation about these, arms control and military exercise and military deployments and these kinds of negotiations, he can get that. He can declare some kind of victory and go home. But what if he really wants, most of all, is a new government in Kyiv? If he really wants a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, then all the rest of this discussion about European security is a sideshow to that main issue. And that's what worries me the most, that will undermine the current government of Ukraine, and whether through military activity or other means affect regime change in Ukraine. And I think there is a good chance for us to believe that that is what he really wants. And so while I am more optimistic that there are off-ramps available if he wants them than I was a few weeks ago, that is still the main question that remains for me, because that is something that the United States and its partners can't help him with.
Thank you very much, Jim, for extremely helpful comments. I think we saw here a range from kind of the most pessimistic view of Bill, and Charlie maybe a little bit in between, and Jim seems to be the most optimistic about the likelihood of war and maybe possibility for certain diplomatic arrangement, maybe. Now, after this great presentation, let's turn to the public and to the audience. And I see already Glenn is asking a question, looking at the worst case scenario, what happens if Russia invades and successfully conquers? What's next? A, for the international system, and B, the role of Russia in other processes, e.g. Iran nuclear talks, etc. Who would like to start to respond to that? Bill, Charlie, Jim? Jim, okay. Have you seen the question? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, who has a problem unmuting? Just a second, please. Can you do it now?
Yes. Can I speak now?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I would like to say a question and some comments about the, thank you for this very interesting observations, but I must say that I share different type of observation. First, I would like to say that it's not the right thing from the US to ignore the way Russia, and especially the President Putin, they are looking at the expansion of NATO to the east, because they accept it in a different way. And if we would like to have any kind of solution of this conflict in Ukraine, we should really understand the way of thinking of this partner, I would say. And another thing, I would say that I not agree about this term, troublemaker, looking at the President Putin, because he is the opponent, he is another partner, is someone that we should really understand the way of his way of thinking. And if I would say, I have this experience, I mean, I was posted in the Soviet Union during the breakup of the Soviet Union, and later on, they renewed the relations between Israel and Russia. And I must say that this trauma of the breakup of the Soviet Union is something real. It's not a card, this card, you know, in the policy and the, you know, the relations between Russia and the US. This is really something real. And we knew him those years when he used to work in Sobchak, in St. Petersburg, those years. And that was really something that I think has a huge influence on his way handling the Russia foreign policy, or the way Russia is behaving in the international system. So I think that there is some way I would allow myself to say that with our colleagues, I think that this is some kind of obstacle which I can say that in the West, and especially in the US, there's some kind of difficulties in really to understand his way of thinking. And what I would like to say, one very short comment, as far as I know, during the late 90s, there were some American policymakers saying something, the way they see the geostrategic importance of Ukraine from the Russian point of view. That was, I think that was the Secretary of Defense, one thing, and the head of the National Security Council, the Americans, in the late 90s, 96, 97. And their view was that Ukraine is huge, important. It's critically important, pivot state, important for the Russian geostrategic, because this is really the key for the integrity, territorial integrity of Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this is something so crucial for the Russians, should be very crucial for them in order to understand, to try to not really control, but to get the hegemony in this part of the Ukraine. And that, so I think, I'm sure that Putin knows these ideas of what his American colleagues of those years. So I would, the way I see the conflict now, the tension in Ukraine, I would say that this is based on geostrategic analysis and geostrategic way the Russian and the President Putin, they see it, the importance of Ukraine. So this is really the issue. This is the really issue, not the Russian, the Slavics, the people who has the Russian passport, etc. And I would say that in order to really to try to keep down all this tension and to try to find a common language and not to have the Ukrainians people as sacrifice, you know, the way I saw it, I say another word if I have the time, but what is really important, this is between two superpowers, great powers. And the Ukrainians are really on this chess board, and they are going to pay the price or the cost of this confrontation between two superpowers. And I was in the field those years during the color revolutions in Georgia, and in the later on 2003, 2004, 4 and 5, and in Ukraine, and we could see it in some other places. And I must say that these people, poor people in Georgia and Ukraine, the first round, they were sacrificed by the superpowers, and they were supported, let's say, by the US those years. Expected to get this support and help, but they were left alone. So I would say, again, I want just one last word, that I would, that's the way I see it. This is really geostrategic confrontation, and the people are not really important in this, not the Ukrainian people, not some other. And that's, in case of responsibility from both sides, but the US as well, that's the way to see this confrontation, and that's the way to write and find the real solution for this confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avinoam. Yeah, maybe we'll turn back to our experts and answer some of the points that were raised. So now all of you are unmuted, hopefully. Bill, you would like to comment on some of the points raised?
Yeah, super quickly, I agree with what was said, that these, I also accept as that a lot of this can be understood in terms of traditional strategic considerations, notwithstanding the fact that Putin seems to care a lot about the so-called, sort of historical shared community of Eastern Slavic people, and writes a lot about it in pseudo-historical essays, and goes to great lengths to exposit all of this. I wanted to have a debate on the relative importance of causes. I would definitely put fairly traditional strategic concerns of great powers, as Charlie Kupchan said, at the top of the agenda. Some of the other questions in here, I see a question 2 from Glenn: NATO enlargement but not NATO deepening. How does Putin view that? I mean, I think that's really one of the questions that gets at some of the previous comments, which is that when you're leading a great power, you're thinking not only about today, but you're thinking about the future. And even an alliance that says it's defensive and that has only rotational deployments and that has refrained from the deployment of certain kinds of weapons today may not be so nice tomorrow. In other words, what the Russian leadership cares about, in part, is preventing long-term threats to its security, just as, for example, the United States and other countries take costly action at times to prevent long-term threats to their security. And that's how they view this. Once certain facts are created on the ground, once Ukraine is integrated into NATO, whether formally or informally, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, things can happen, which would be very So that's kind of the thinking there about the deepening. I completely understand Jim's point that any smart Russian should be able to see that their own aggressive behavior is unifying NATO and causing NATO to adopt a more serious cooperation, get policies that might end up making Russia less secure. There's international relations terminology to describe such a situation, the security dilemma. It's an overused term, but I think it applies in this case because the Russians are fully aware of what this is, of the effect that their bellicose strategy has. Yet they have apparently calculated that they would rather stop what they see as a deteriorating security situation now, even at that cost, than let it keep deteriorating, because they're seeing the future is getting worse and worse from their perspective in terms of what's happening with the European security architecture. Final question I see on there is about internal processes and what the domestic motivations are. Again, I spent many decades, sort of studying Moscow's foreign policy and don't claim to be a great expert on domestic policy. I'm most persuaded by those analyses and analysts who do not see a strong immediate domestic political motivation. In fact, it's highly unlikely that any significant use of military force in Ukraine would be particularly popular with the Russian citizens. Therefore, I think that far from being driven by immediate concerns of domestic politics, Putin and his leadership team are acting despite strong domestic disincentives. So I completely don't buy the domestic politics explanation of this. However, there is good evidence that he cares about long-term precedents and that he does care about how he will be seen 20 or 30, 40, 50 years from now by historians. Will he be seen as the leader who presided over Russia's loss on this particular question? or not. And, you know, he's constantly looking at documents and asking his people to go to the archives and highly tendentiously and unprofessionally select specific documents that he wants to publicize. He had this whole contretemps with Poland over the World War II. So he cares about that kind of stuff. So I would grant that there's a kind of a non-purely strategic element possibly in the matrix of thinking somewhere. But I conclude where I started, that I think that Charlie is right, that any government sitting in Moscow, whatever its makeup and whatever its ideology, would be similarly dissatisfied with the way things have turned out in Europe and would try to do something to reverse it.
May I add another question to Charlie and Jim? What about the fear of that a color revolution might happen in Moscow? Is there no fear that if, you know, democracy spreads all over Eastern Europe and reaches now, is there no, this is not concern of Putin and his cohorts and his Russian elite? Jim, you would like to comment?
Yeah, and then I have a couple other thoughts in response to some of the other points that have been made. Yeah, I think this has been a huge issue over the last 2 decades, ever since we started seeing color revolutions in places like Ukraine and Georgia in the early 2000s. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important when people fixate on NATO enlargement. When we look at the period that was quite formative for Putin in his early presidency, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, there were a lot of reasons for him to be concerned, right? It wasn't just about NATO enlargement. NATO bombed Kosovo in 1999. George W. Bush walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001. U.S. went to war in Iraq in 2003, despite Russians' objections as a permanent member of the Security Council. And the color revolutions are important because Putin doesn't see these as homegrown reformers seeking to transform their countries. He sees these as Western influenced and, you know, sort of Western plots to change these governments. And he fears that the West wants to do the same with respect to his own regime in Moscow. So I think that he has a huge stake in how these governments, how these countries are governed. And I think it is important to him to prevent Ukraine from becoming a successful independent country. Just 3 other points I wanted to make. One is just going back to Charlie's point about language that could be found diplomatically on the issue of Ukraine and NATO and NATO membership. I also, I agree with that. And my colleague, Steve Pfeiffer, my Brookings and Stanford colleague, Steve Pfeiffer, former ambassador to Ukraine, has this phrase, not now, but not never, right? That the United States and its allies can't really formally close the door given the nature of NATO, but there's no prospect of Ukraine coming in anytime soon. So there must be a way to create some diplomatic language that gets to this not now, not never. I mean, the other way that this could come about or a different approach would be for Ukraine itself to declare its future as a neutral country and for it to say it was no longer interested. But I think politically, that's pretty unlikely in Ukraine. The very first question that Glenn asked about what would happen if there is a war, I think this gets to a really important point, which is that people are looking at this situation as a sort of either or, war or diplomacy, when in fact, even if there's a war, there will still be a need for diplomacy. And so I think, you know, the assurance of NATO allies, you know, imposing costs on Russia. But Russia is still going to be a country that for which there needs to be diplomacy, just as there was when the West and Russia were Cold War adversaries. And then last point on this issue of how the United States, I don't know which top official was talking about Ukraine in the earlier comments, but I think it is worth noting that certainly in the 90s, the frame the United States was using with respect to Ukraine, especially in the Clinton administration, very important for Bill Clinton, that he was very persuaded by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, former US National Security Advisor, who made the argument that without Ukraine, Russia would basically be forced to become a normal nation state and would have a relationship with the West as a non-empire and a normal nation state. And so Ukraine was key to moving Russia away from its imperial past. And in fact, if you look at the declassified memorandum of conversation between Clinton and Yeltsin in May of 1997 in Helsinki, Yeltsin, going into the NATO-Russia Founding Act said, I don't have a choice. I mean, I'm going to have to sign this thing, but I would like to have a side agreement with you, a gentleman's agreement with you, that you will never take former Soviet republics into NATO, especially Ukraine. And Clinton had two responses. One was, I can't do that. And, even if we went into a closet and shook hands, it would become public and the Congress would go crazy. But also he said to him, Boris, this isn't what you want either, because you don't want Russia to be that kind of country. I mean, Clinton had really internalized this idea that Russia shouldn't want to be an empire. And so it should relish the idea of Ukrainian independence, because then it could, in the Brzezinski formula, Russia could then become a normal nation state. And so I think that was a very powerful frame that people at the top of the Clinton administration, including the president, had in mind in that period.
Thank you very much. Charles, do you want to say your opinion about this?
I'll just make two quick comments so we have more time for our participants. One is that I agree with Jim that the real threat to Russia from Ukraine is not NATO, it's Ukraine. It's that Ukraine could become a success story, and that Putin would fear that the democratic market, non-corrupt Ukraine, if it were ever to emerge, would come his way. And so my best guess is that Russia will continue to rely on less than overt forms of destabilizing Ukraine, because they do it well, whether it's penetration of the intelligence services, whether it is cyber, whether it is working through oligarchs with whom they have good contacts. They can kind of get what they want without occupying the country. And I guess my second point, and this would be, I guess, a question to Bill, what do you think the military option is that Russia could stomach that would achieve its objectives? Because I think we all agree that so far the prospect is one in which it doesn't pay off. More NATO forces on the eastern flank, biting economic sanctions, trying to occupy a country that doesn't want to be occupied, and unifying. No one else could. So as someone who studies Russian foreign policy, what do you think their viable, feasible military option is?
Well, I know there are other people queued up, but very quickly, that's what you think. That's what Jim thinks. That's expensive, costly, quagmire, forever war, disaster. That's what lots of people think. What we don't know is what does the general staff think, and what does the Ministry of Defense think, and what does Putin think, what does Shoigu think. I do agree with what was said. I think it was Jim, maybe both of you guys, that a quick operation that just degrades some destroys all or some of Ukraine's military capacity wouldn't get the objectives that we know that they want. We know that going to the Donbass region and expanding that is not going to get what they want. So I don't see how they get what they want without a regime change, without the military force leading to a new government in Kiev that will be more compatible with their understanding of what they would like. And how that happens is anybody's guess. and why but the only point I would make is that it is not entirely, is that what matters is what their assessment is of the domestic dynamics within Ukraine once it's smacked with force. Will the Ukrainians wake up the next day and take up arms? Will they want to go to work and keep receiving paychecks? Will they conclude that? So anyway, that's the only way it works. And I think it's probably unlikely, but then I'm living in a country which has not had a very good result when it's tried to do regime change. So I'm affected by that particular view.
Bill, you have written quite a lot about the status issue in international relations. Do you think that's, I mean, you emphasize obviously like Charlie and Jim, the security factor. Do you think the status, I mean, to be considered and regarded and accepted as a great power is a major motivation for Putin and his group of kind of the Russian current elite? And
yes, I do, but it's inseparable from these concerns. I mean, status means in practice that your concerns, your considerations, your interests are taken into consideration by your partners. By definition, Putin says, the fact that we for 20 years raised these issues with the West and they never, ever get addressed is a sign that you are not respecting our status as a great power in Europe. But that is inseparable from security, or it's very difficult to separate from the security concerns.
Yeah, and a more general question. I mean, supposedly after the end of the Cold War, the United States and European hope to move to kind of a more liberal international order, be able to make their choices, and definitely territorial integrity will be a key norm. Do you think that the rise of China and now the modernization of military of Russia is posing a major challenge to that, and we are moving back to a world of great powers in which they more or less kind of have their own sphere of influence, and they determine and they kind of the leverage and the freedom of action of small states is declining in this kind of world, and the liberal world in this, that's another aspect in which it is challenged by Putin and potentially by China, and also what will be the influence on Taiwan of all of that, of Ukraine and China and Taiwan?
Maybe I'll start.
Okay.
You know, for me, Benny, the big concern is not Russian intervention in Ukraine, China, it's us. It's the prospect that the liberal system is weak from within. And we haven't said much about this yet, but for me, you know, the last thing that Joe Biden needs right now is a crisis over Ukraine and a political focus and preoccupation with the rearmament of NATO's eastern flank. He's got his hands full, not just with, you know, Afghanistan and North Korea and Iran and China, but with a lagging political support here in the United States. And so for me, you know, build back better, electoral reform, this is all critical to getting the West back up on its feet. And so right now, I don't really care about the spread of the international system. That's not on for now. What I want to see is it survive here and in Europe and in Israel, because if that doesn't happen, forget it. All bets are off. And then, you know, assuming that we get our shit together, to put it nicely, then I do think that we're going to be in a world in which we'll see a more fragmented system in which China will pose a challenge to norms and to a rules-based system that is new, and that for the first time in its history, the United States faces a full spectrum peer competitor. That's going to change the world.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, that's a great point.
If I can come
Jim,
in.
Jim,
Yeah.
please.
So I just, Benny, wanted to tie your question to this question in the chat about U.S.-China being the main focus. Why not use this crisis? Which is that, I mean, the Biden administration came into office really determined to focus the United States on the Indo-Pacific and on China. I mean, a lot of certainly the key person at the White House, with the portfolio for the Indo-Pacific, Kurt Campbell, I mean, he had been involved in the Obama administration and the so-called pivot, which didn't really occur to the extent that team wanted at that time, because there were things that were happening in other parts of the world. And I think they were really determined that they weren't going to let anything distract them from the Indo-Pacific. And we saw that in their reaction to a variety of things that occurred in 2021, whether it was in Gaza or Afghanistan or even in Europe until now. And we saw Biden talk about how he wanted a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, which, a stable and predictable relationship with Putin, I don't believe was ever really in the cards. I mean, Putin isn't really about being stable and predictable in his relations with the United States. And so here you have an administration that really wanted to focus on China. And now it's stuck spending all this time dealing with this crisis in Ukraine. And it is the lead actor on the Western side, right? There's the Europeans are not, playing much of a role here in the resolution of this crisis. This has really become a US-Russia conversation. And so this is a really good question, right? If they're so focused on the Indo-Pacific, why can't they, find some way to sort of work with the Russians and peel the Russians away from the Chinese? And there are people in this Biden administration who have been thinking about that and whether or not there are prospects there. And I just don't see them. I think the Russians and the Chinese have such a strong desire to undermine and weaken the United States that is just a very powerful glue that holds the two of them together for the foreseeable future. And they've deepened their relationship, and they benefit from that relationship in their number one priority, which is to lessen the role of the United States to dictate in world affairs as it was able to do coming out of the end of the Cold War. I don't think there's a huge connection between Taiwan and Ukraine. I think that the United States commitment to Taiwan has always been much more significant, and Biden's own language on Taiwan was pretty clear throughout 2021, and at a much higher level in terms of defense of Taiwan. I think the idea that China's watching this, and if the United States, isn't, as serious as they could be about the defense of Ukraine, that's going to give China a green light to go into, try to take over Taiwan. I don't see it. And I don't think that's a really reasonable connection to draw.
Thank you very much, Jim. Bill, would you like to comment on the credibility vis-a-vis Taiwan and the liberal international order and the challenges to that, and also what Charlie raised about how the cleavages in the American domestic politics are going to influence American international involvement vis-a-vis Putin, but also vis-a-vis China?
Just super quick, because there are still hands up, including I'm seeing a raised hand in my upper left by a gentleman whose name is only in Hebrew, so I can't say what it is. I don't know if it's just drawing your attention to that okay. Gentleman up there. But anyway, super quick in response is that I agree completely with what Charlie said on liberal international order. It's time for a conservative approach to the liberal international order, to getting the house in order, both in terms of its external alliances and in terms of its domestic politics within each of its members. So expanding it and telling the authoritarian great powers with whom we are rivals, telling them that, you know, how they should organize their domestic politics, like that's not a good thing to be doing today. I mean, that's a bad approach to strategy. And the Biden administration came into office kind of speaking in two voices with this. At times talking about it's time for democracies to get together, it's time to unite the world of democracies, and it's time to tell these authoritarians how to run their domestic politics. And I just think that this is probably a very ill-framed policy at the moment. The second point is that everything that Charlie and Jim said about the Biden administration, build back better, focus on China, Putin is aware of all of those things, which is one reason why he thought this was a good time to settle his long-standing 20-year dissatisfaction with the European security order. Why not now? America needs to focus at home. America is objectively declining with respect to China. Don't forget, for Russia, the rise of China is great, even though it means that Russia is weaker vis-a-vis China. It means that Russia is stronger vis-a-vis the United States. And so it gives Russia greater leverage vis-a-vis the United States. So good time to settle the problem. Finally, what's the interaction between this and our travails in East Asia with the decisive rise of China, where China is really it's in the process of translating its latent power into actual military capabilities. I think it's very problematic because it means the United States can't really, Russia has enough power to prevent the United States from fully focusing on China, which is really good for China. I think China's playing this very carefully, this crisis. It certainly doesn't want to be seen to be egging on Moscow. But if this ends up in a military crisis and a prolonged insurgency war, Cold War, sanctions war, I don't see how China does pretty largely from that. So basically, Russia gets a vote in whether we get, I mean, one way of putting it is my good friend, the analyst Michael Coffin puts it, it's not like the way the Americans came into office, like we remodeled the kitchen, that's Europe, and now we're going to go remodel the living room and get the new furniture in there. That's Asia. Well, sorry, Putin is saying, sorry, your remodeling job on the kitchen is falling apart. You got to go back and pay attention to the kitchen. So we can't do both of these things at once. So, you know, in a way, it is indeed lessons in moving away from that era of unprecedented US dominance that we all knew and loved. And it's showing us a new world of great power competition that you're talking about, Benny.
Thank you very much. I think that Daniel Weiner has a question about emotion and their influence on this issue, like revenge on Putin's side. Conversely, can there be a desire from Putin to gain legitimacy from like-minded international audiences by pushing Biden and the US back?
Well, I just talked, but I'll just say two things on this. There's a global Putin cult that includes Tucker Carlson, a very famous newscaster in the United States on Fox News. And I think they pay attention to the fact that, you know, in presenting themselves as the representatives of conservative values, that there can be a transnational coalition that has some sort of ideological affinity with what Putin claims to stand for. And we saw that with the Viktor Orban visit to Moscow yesterday. But the emotional thing, I would say that Putin himself is extremely careful in his discussions of foreign leaders. He himself would never allow himself to make a comment like that. He's far more disciplined and professional, a statesperson, to ever allow such thing to pass his lips. And he has a little bit of contempt for leaders like Biden who don't have that kind of self-control. That said, he's such a professional, but I don't think he would allow any such misstep on the part of Biden or any such ad hominem comment by Biden to get in the way of a deal if he thought a deal with the United States was meeting Russia's interests.
So I agree with, oh, go ahead.
Jim?
No, I agree with that. But I do think it's worth noting. I mean, these grievances that Putin has toward the United States and the West, they are real. I mean, I think, you know, his hatred for the United States is quite high. And I mean, it goes back to this view that, and there was a question about sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? I mean, you know, that was a formative experience for him. He's in East Germany, no help from Moscow, furious at what's happening, furious at the way that the collapse occurred, furious that there are Russians who are, you know, as he put it in 2014, living in one country one day and waking up the next day in a different country. What he saw as the determination of the West and the United States in particular to humiliate Russia. His job since he came into office more than 20 years ago, as he sees it, has been to rebuild the Russian state and to bring Russia back as a great power. He's done those two things, but he still, I think, holds these significant grievances. The United States dictated the terms of the post-Cold War European order, and he believes he's in a position to do something about that and to get a change in the trajectory. And I think that we are seeing him do something about that. The problem is, I think there's a limit to what he can do about that. He's not going to get what he wants with respect to NATO. As I said, there are other things he can get. And so I think the grievances will remain significant. And that's why I also think that the Russia-China relationship will only deepen because they both have a desire to bring the United States down from its earlier position. And as Charlie pointed out, the United States is doing a great job of this on its own internally.
Kind of final question, if I may. Do you see the kind of the direction of development of the relation between these three great powers, China and Russia on the one hand and the United States on the other hand, developing eventually towards some kind of a detente because of the nuclear deterrence, because of the high cost of war, supposedly globalization, economic independence, especially China and the United States, or as we see it now, as actually great power competition becoming more and more risky, and even with some danger of escalation to military confrontation, potentially on Taiwan or South China Sea, or something of this nature. So is it kind of the Mearsheimer world or John Eikenberry world, or whatever? What do you think the direction?
Let me jump in there, and then I'm going to have to run.
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that I find highly distressing about the potential conflict over Ukraine is as we've been discussing, this is a conflict that doesn't need to happen because it's over a principle, and the reality is that principle is not going to be fulfilled anytime soon, if ever. But the other is that I do think that if Russia invades Ukraine, it will create a competitive dynamic in the international system. It's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of autocracies versus democracies in a way that, to me, would be very destructive, because we live in a world that is irretrievably interdependent. And one of the things that I think has been lacking in the Biden administration's policy, they've been good on we're going to stand up to you, we're going to push back, we're going to contain. But what seems to me is missing is, well, how are we going to tackle climate change and nuclear proliferation and pandemics and other global problems if there isn't also some kind of mechanism for working across ideological dividing lines? That, to me, we know how to work with the West. We know how democracies can cooperate. But what's missing for me is, how are we going to cooperate across ideological dividing lines? And if war breaks out in Ukraine, that becomes even more difficult.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Bill, Jim?
I can't say better than what Charlie just said. I thought, please just pretend as if I was the one just talking.
I'll just, in answer to your question about whether we're likely to see a more dangerous world going forward, yes, I think we are. And I think partly that's because of the challenge for the United States of adjusting to a world in which it doesn't dominate the way it did earlier. And I think that's actually very hard for US decision makers. And there are a lot of really important questions to be asking about the nature of US commitments and about the kind of relationship it seeks. And I just wanted to say again about this US-China-Russia dynamic. There are a lot of people who are saying, well, why can't we have a reverse Kissinger, right? Why, you know, the US reached out to China in the early 70s against the Soviet Union. And why isn't the United States reaching out to Russia to try to split the Russia-China thing? I mean, remember that what Kissinger and Nixon were doing, they were taking advantage of a split that was already there. The Soviets and the Chinese had already split. It was finally the United States, after way too long of not having recognized the opportunities, pursuing a relationship with China that would sort of enhance the US position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So they took advantage of an opportunity. The Russian and Chinese today are quite close for the reasons that I mentioned before, and have good reason in their view for pushing back against, you know, the United States and seeking to undermine the US role in the world. And so I don't think that opportunity for the so-called reverse Kissinger is there, as some people are suggesting.
Do you think, maybe Bill, do you think that the kind of common threats to humanity, some of them mentioned by Charlie, like climate change and pandemic and nuclear proliferation, might bring some cooperation? Thank you, Charlie. Or are basically kind of in a realist worldview, all these, you know, common global threats to humanity?
That's a really big question, and it could be a whole seminar in itself where we could really deploy different kinds of IR theories and institutionalists, not just, frankly, realists like me. But I would say that I expect that there will be some continued note that, anyway, it's a complicated question. Much of the cooperation on climate change is moving out of big multilateral agreements towards agreements for each country to do its own thing, but then they pledge to do you've seen the recent developments on the climate change front. Pandemic anyway, bottom line is, the realist side of the equation is, how bad will the geopolitical competition get? How bad will the great power rivalry get? Will it fully reach Cold War levels, or will the interdependence and the common problems that you're referring to, Benny, themselves act as a brake? I personally believe that we are headed towards what might be called sort of Cold War light, in the sense that it's not quite as intense as the Cold War and not quite as large a barrier to cooperation on matters of mutual concern as the Cold War was. And remember, even in the Cold War, we had pretty good cooperation on non-proliferation, and we had cooperation on other issues. So it's not complete doom and gloom. It's just the level of great power competition will be sufficiently high, I should say, to really put a brake on cooperation that really we could use.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Bill Wohlforth. Thank you very much, Professor James Goldgeier. Thank you very much, Professor Charlie Kupchan. I think it was an exciting event. Actually, we had quite a large audience, over 80 person, the height of the event, and I think we learned quite a lot from you. We appreciate your time and especially your insights about what's going on in Russia, but also what's going on in the world more broadly. And thank you very much, the audience, for your patience, for the great questions, and looking forward to have other events like this. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Benny.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rakefet.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Okay. So you recorded, right? הקלטת, כן?
Yes.
Okay.